Hello, and you're watching the History Fella channel. In this video we're looking at Big-Nosed George Parrot. A short but violent reign of terror and ruthlessness began in January 1879 when a gang led by a man by the name of Big-Nosed George Parrot robbed a merchant of $14,000. The merchant, Morris Khan, was in a military wagon but escorted by soldiers who were several hundred yards to the rear. At the point where the wagon was out of sight of the escorting soldiers, the gang struck and was away before the escort arrived. The gang went on to rob stagecoaches and freight wagons in various states, among them Montana, Dakota, and Wyoming. They appeared to make their headquarters in Miles City, and if the law started to show an interest in their whereabouts, they would retreat to the big mountains of Wyoming, the Dakota Badlands, or the prairies of Montana. After one of their raids, the gang went to Miles City to live it up and spend their ill-gotten gains. The law, who was collecting evidence about the gang, was told that Big-Nosed George Parrot was spending large amounts of cash in the city. Marshal Hank Wormwood and some of his deputies arrived in Miles City and arrested Parrot and some of his gang. Put on trial, a number of the witnesses came forward to swear on oath that Parrot and his men were in Canada at the time of the alleged robbery. It was quite obvious that all the witnesses had lied, but nothing could be proved against them. The robberies continued, and when an attempt to derail a Union Pacific train in order to get to the express car failed, 2 lawmen who trailed the gang were murdered. Investigations and information from an informer showed that George Parrot had led the gang that attempted the robbery and had killed the 2 lawmen. The authorities placed a reward of $1,000 for the capture of George Parrot and approached U.S. Marshal John X. Beadler, who had a reputation for being one of the best manhunters in the West. After weeks of trailing the gang, Beadler traced them to a small town in Montana. In front of a saloon called John Chinook's, Beadler recognized 2 of George Parrot's gang. There was a problem in that U.S. Marshal Beadler had a pronounced limp and was well known to most of the criminals in the various states. If he were to be recognized, then the gang would probably escape. So Beadler enlisted the help of a local farmhand by the name of Lem Wilson, who would risk his life in helping the marshal. The 2 men outside the saloon would obviously keep watch, and so would suspect anything out of the ordinary. Lem Wilson was wearing the normal bib and braces overalls, worn by all farmhands, and so was completely in place. Placing 2 handguns behind the overall bib, Wilson walked towards the saloon and was confronted by one of the outlaws who wanted to know where he was going. Wilson told him he was going into the saloon and walked past. The moment he was past them and behind them, he pulled out the guns and told them to raise their hands. Minutes later it was all over, and Big-Nosed George Parrot and most of his gang were in custody. George Parrot was taken to Rawlins, Wyoming, where he was charged with the murders of the 2 lawmen and found guilty. Whilst in jail awaiting execution, he tried to escape by beating a guard, but was foiled by the wife of one of the other guards, who raised the alarm. When the local citizens heard of this, they were so enraged that they dragged George Parrot from his cell and lynched him from the telegraph pole. That would normally be the end of the episode in the life of an outlaw, but Big-Nosed George Parrot's body was claimed by Doctors Thomas McGee and Eugene Osborne. They made a death mask of him and then carried out a series of experiments on his body. They took out the brain to see if it showed any abnormalities that might explain his criminal behaviour, which it didn't, and then had the body skinned and the skin sent to a tannery in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Osborne then asked the tannery to make him a pair of shoes using the skin, which they duly did. The top of Parrot's skull was crudely sawn off and was presented to 15-year-old Lillian Heath, then a medical assistant to McGee. She became the first female doctor in Wyoming and is said to have used the cap as an ashtray, a pen holder, and a doorstop. Dr. Osborne wore the shoes for many years, and when elected state governor, is said to have worn the shoes to the inaugural ball. The shoes are now on display in Carbon County Museum, Rawlins, Wyoming. The remaining parts of George Parrot's body were crammed into a whiskey barrel and buried. It was found in 1950 when construction workers were digging new foundations for a building behind Dr. McGee's old office. The bones were reburied, but the skull was given to the museum in Wyoming.